They called the dry stretch the Cimarron Cutoff, though cutoff made it sound like a mercy. Nothing about it was merciful. It ran from the Arkansas down over grass baked into wire and soil baked into brick, across wind-worn flats where buffalo bones stuck out like old wagon pegs. Water came by rumor at Middle Spring if a traveler was charitable in memory, at the foot of the Rabbit Ears if Providence woke in time, and sometimes not at all. The wagons took it because time was money, and the long bend through the mountains cost time, so they gambled with thirst and went south on the Cimarron, iron tires hissing over dust as fine as flour. Elias Boone Hardesty walked ahead of a small caravan that morning, boots scuffed white, hat brim gone to ragged scallops. He was not with the traders exactly, and not apart from them like a coyote that shadowed a herd for luck. A rolled map rode tight under his hunting shirt, wrapped in oilskin, the corners fretted by his fingers until the paper felt almost soft. He had told no one what it showed. He had said only that he was bound for the Sangre de Cristo and would take the short road to make up time. He had been a trapper, back when mountain streams still winked with sign and the talk at winter camp was of plews and prime. These days the talk turned more and more to robes, buffalo robes by the hundredweight, because beaver hats were passing out of fashion in faraway parlors where no one knew the taste of green willow tea. The shift had pushed men like Elias into strange corners. Trapping had given him a calendar spring rise, fall set, rendezvous, and then had taken that calendar away, as if to prove that a man's work was something you leased from the world and could be evicted from at any time. The map came to him at Pecos, in the shell of the old mission, where swallows nested in the cracked vaulting and sunlight laid ladders across the dust. A friar lay in the lee of a broken wall, skin the color of old paper, his hands smelling faintly of wine and herbs. Maybe he had been Spaniard once, or maybe not. The voice was thin as a reed flute and slipped between languages the way water slips between stones. He talked of Minas Perdidas, the lost mines hidden under red cliffs where the snow came sudden and stayed late, where crucibles once cooled in the shade of rock and quicksilver burned the lungs of men who took their pay in silence. He said the place had markers, a double cross chiseled into a lintel stone and a sun with 4 rays. Then he took Elias's hand, traced a crooked valley with the nail of one finger, and gave him a folded scrap from his cassock. The friar went still before sundown. Elias never learned his name. If it had been only a story, Elias might have left it there. But the paper was real rag stock, gritty to the touch, lines drawn in a patient hand with iron gall. The ink had browned to the color of tobacco. The compass rose wore a cross where north should be, and the sangre were sketched as a jagged picket line, teeth bared against the plains. Where the canyons gathered into a gnarl, the friar's mark stood plain, a small, neat sign like a prayer cut short. The caravan reached Bent's Fort 2 weeks later, or what would be the fort. The walls were ribs, the clay still wet in places, the great adobe skull of it rising from the Arkansas like something the river itself had coughed up. Charles Bent walked the site with a measuring stick and a ledger tucked under one arm, hair tied back with a strip of cloth, his eyes counting every stroke of every trowel. Sarin Street. Vrain stood near the blacksmith's pit, talking beef and corn and wages with a crew of Hispano hands from Taos, smoke from the charcoal drifting around his words. What would soon be a citadel of trade was, in that hour, a plan turning into a place. Elias came in with the wagons and peeled away toward the corral. Trade cracked and popped around him, Cheyenne women fingering calico bright. Enough to sting the eye, Arapaho men weighing the worth of percussion caps against the certainty of flint, a French engagée laughing too loudly at a joke not told for her benefit. Robes hung in heavy stacks under shade screens, the smell of them sweet and rank fat and earth and sun. Out by the river someone tested a new hawken, the report skimming the braids of the water like a thrown stone. In the half-built main room, an anvil rang steady as church bells. Hardesty. Bent's voice carried a flat edge that could slice meat thin. "You look like a man who's taught himself patience." "I never was much for classes," Elias said. Bent's smile was as quick as it was short. "You're back of schedule for spring set and ahead of schedule for fall. Means you're not trapping. Means you've got something else in your pocket." Street. Vrain joined them, sleeves rolled, wrists reddened by lime. "If it's whiskey you're holding, sir, we'll pay fair and take the plate." "Barrel." "Not whiskey," Elias said. "Map." The word drew attention as surely as a handful of pebbles thrown on a tin roof. A few men looked over with the soft hunger that maps bring to hard places. Others smirked as if they'd heard a child brag about gold under his bed. "Show it," Bent said, not unkindly. "In time," Elias answered, "if it proves itself." Street Vrain cocked his head. "They are breeding maps in Taos now, I hear. One mare produces 4 colts by spring." Laughter floated over the yard, but not cruelly. This was frontier laughter, the kind you offered a stranger so he could choose to laugh with you and be less a stranger. Elias let it pass. "I heard a friar," he said. "Saw a friar. He died at Pecos." His hand drew this. "Pecos is ruin and ghosts," Bent said, eyes going to the line of the wall as if measurements were safer than legends. "I will trade for your map when it shows me beaver or robes." "Robes most of all." Beaver buyers in. Street Louis are looking at cloth hats and making figures speak Latin. "Beaver dies when men get clever," a trader said from a nearby stack of kegs. "Robes only die when winter forgets itself." Elias unrolled the oilskin just enough to see the friar's marks, then rolled it tight again. "Robes won't vanish and ore won't spoil," he said. "There's talk of old Spanish works high in the Sangre, smelter slag, a lintel with a cross. If a man knew where to put a pick, he could turn one legend into many wagons." Street Vrain considered his hands, then wiped them on his apron. "Or turn many wagons into a single grave. I have seen mines swallow men whole, and I have seen men swallow mines and die of the absence. Tell me this, Elias Boone, what is it you want? Money? A name? A road with your boot prints baked into it?" Elias looked toward the river. The Arkansas went by as if it had somewhere to be that did not require conversation. "I want the truth of a line drawn by a dying hand," he said, "and a share of what the line points to if the world is generous." Bent nodded as if a figure had come out even. "Truth pays worst of any trade good we handle. But I respect a man who prices it high. You'll eat on the wall crew tonight. If you can lift a hod, you'll sleep where the wind doesn't. And you'll keep that map close, because every fool who laughs at it wants it worse than you do." By evening the fort threw a square of shade the size of a meadow. Cook smoke, mule breath, the breath of men, everything blurred into a single temperament. Straps creaked. The blacksmith's hammer settled into a rhythm that soothed better than drink. Down by the corrals, a boy new in from Franklin ran a hand along a robe and made a face he thought was tough. Cheyenne men watched him without interest, the way old trees watch a sapling take wind. Elias ate with the hod carriers, tortillas hot from a como, beans cooked with a bone that might have seen better days. He said little. The map lay against his chest like a second sternum, lending him posture he had not earned. When the stars blew out of the sky and the coyotes began to wind the first chords of their night song, he unrolled his pallet near the half-finished east wall and lay back to count the constellations he remembered from colder camps. He tried, just once, to look at the whole of what he intended. A road south on the Cimarron, then west along the spine of the Sangre, up into Redstone where eagles turned and snow hid in seams through summer. He saw the friar's mark in his mind's eye double-cross, sun, with 4 rays chiseled small as faith but deep enough to last. He saw slag piles black as burned bread. He saw, too, the other side of such seeing, the ground giving underfoot, men shouting from inside a whispering hill, the weight of history turning a man into a wedge and then into a rumor. Laughter drifted from the trader's fire, a story about Kit Carson when he was hardly more than a boy, about a misstep with a mule and a lesson learned. Names like that made their own weather. You could stand under them and get wet, or you could walk on. Elias rolled onto his side, thinking of Pecos and of a hand that had trembled as it drew a canyon. The map was a promise and a dare both. Most men at the fort believed in beaver when they could hold it, robes when they could smell it, lead when they could pour it. They believed in tools and prices. They did not believe in lines on paper, not unless those lines were orders signed by someone who could hang you for ignoring them. But ridicule on the frontier was a light thing, meant to test the weight of a man. The heavier thing was silence, and Elias felt that press from the moment he tucked the oilskin under his shirt. The silence of ore under stone, the silence of the friar when breath left him. The silence that gathers before a man makes himself into his own witness. He slept finally with the river's voice in his ears. Somewhere in the night a wolf sang 2 notes and then stopped, as if remembering an appointment elsewhere. The fort stood unfinished and sturdy in the moonlight, a promise of safety that would never be absolute. East, the Cimarron waited, already dry. West, the Sangre de Cristo lifted a broken red lip against the stars. Between them, a man and a map kept each other honest. In the morning, Elias Boone Hardesty would shoulder both and walk into the kind of daylight that burns away everything but what a man truly believes. By the time Elias Boone Hardesty left Bent's Fort behind him, the Arkansas was already running low, its bed split into a dozen shining veins. The wagons dwindled eastward, dust rising behind them like prayers that would not be answered. He turned south alone, toward the shadow of the mountains, where rumor said the bones of Pecos Pueblo still stood a tangle of stone and memory, left to the wind. The road was an old one, older than the Santa Fe. Trail, older than the traders who swaggered along it. It had been a priest's path once, carrying friars between missions, then a raider's trail for Apaches and Comanches, then nothing but a scar across the land. Elias carried the map tight to his chest, as though warmth could keep its ink alive. He reached Pecos by dusk on the 5th day. The ruins sat like the ribs of a whale, half buried in sand and cheatgrass. The last rays of sun burned the clay red, the same color the Spaniards had seen when they named the distant mountains Sangre de Cristo. The old church walls still rose 30 feet, pocked by bullets and lightning, and the air inside them smelled of sage and dust. It was here, a season past, that Elias had met the dying friar. He had come upon him by accident while following a trail of Mustang tracks down the arroyo. The man had been lying under the shelter of the fallen bell tower, wrapped in a threadbare habit, his lips gray, his rosary tangled in his fingers. The friar's eyes were clouded with fever, but he spoke with purpose of mines built by hands that never returned, of men who smelted silver by moonlight and were buried in their own tunnels. "The mountain keeps what it takes," he had whispered in Spanish, his accent old and pure. They dug for God but found only themselves. Then, from inside his robe, he had drawn the folded paper, the map. The friar's mark was simple, a double cross above a sunburst, the symbol of light over sacrifice. He traced it once on Elias's palm with a trembling finger. When Elias looked up again, the friar was gone, his last breath taken by the same wind that now moaned through the ruins. Standing there again, Elias felt that moment repeat itself, the friar's voice, the scent of dried blood and sage. He knelt at the base of the broken wall and brushed away the sand. Beneath it lay what looked like old slag, black and glassy, half buried in the soil. He tapped it with his knife. It rang faintly. Smelter waste. By the sound of it, the ghost of a furnace that had burned long before his birth. He took it as a sign. He camped that night on the high bluff above the pueblo, his fire hidden from the wind by a saddle of rock. Coyotes sang below. In the starlight, the Sangre de Cristo range was a jagged silhouette, like a row of dark teeth gnawing the moon. He unfolded the map again, spreading it across his knee. The paper crackled like old bone. The friar's lines were precise. A river looping south, a canyon split by 2 ridges, a pass marked with the sunburst. There were no distances written, no compass directions save the small cross that might mean north or might mean faith. He compared the curve of the drawn river to the Pecos below him. The match was close enough to make a believer of him. He thought then of all the men who had come chasing silver before him. Spaniards with chains and crucifixes, Americans with rifles and greed. All had left something. Of themselves here, their bones, their words, their marks on stone. The friar's mark was only the last in a long ledger. When dawn came, he saddled his horse, a narrow-chested dun that had seen too many miles, and rode west toward the blue wall of the mountains. The plains gave way to pinon and juniper, to slopes cut by dry creeks. He found an old Spanish trail, still faint in the dust, narrow, steep, and stubborn as a scar. By midday he reached a small plateau littered with the remains of an ancient camp, rusted mule shoes, a broken shovel blade, and, half sunk in the earth, a crucifix made of hammered copper. He turned it over in his hands. On the back was scratched the same symbol, the double cross and the sun. He smiled, though it was not joy. The friar had not lied. That evening, clouds built over the peaks, rolling black and heavy. Thunder cracked across the valley, and the air filled with the smell of rain and metal. Elias took shelter in a shallow cave and built a small fire. As the storm passed, he listened to the water drip from the rocks like a slow clock. He pulled out his journal, the one he had kept since his trapping days on the Yellowstone, and began to write. At Pecos, I found what they said was gone, and in it, the voice of a dying man. His map leads west into the Sangre. The marks are true, the symbols old. If I do not return, let this note serve as proof that the lost mines were no myth. They were only waiting for a fool brave enough to believe. He tore the page free and folded it into the map, sealing them together with a strip of wax from his candle stub. The wind outside shifted, and the rain turned to snow, fine, dry flakes that hissed as they hit the fire. He leaned back, staring at the flame, thinking of Bent's Fort and the laughter that had followed him there. By morning, his fire was out, his clothes stiff with frost. He saddled up again and rode higher into the hills. The trail was little more than a whisper through scrub and scree, but he followed it by instinct, as a trapper follows the feel of water beneath frozen ground. Ahead, the mountains rose crimson in the dawn, their faces streaked with snow and iron. He felt then, deep in his chest, the pull of something older than gold, the need to prove the world wrong. Behind him lay ridicule and dust. Ahead, a promise drawn in the hand of a dying friar. Between them, the silence of the high country, waiting to decide whether he was a fool or a legend in the making. By the time Hardesty found his way back to Bent's Fort, the walls had grown taller and the talk louder. The place no longer looked like a gamble, but like a kingdom of mud and muscle, 2 stories of sun-baked adobe wrapped around a square of open sky. The Arkansas ran close enough that the wind carried the smell of wet sand and horse sweat. In every corner, someone was hammering, tanning, trading, or lying about all three. Bent's Fort in those years was a hinge. On the world, one leaf turned toward the wild, the other toward Street Louis. The wagons came fat with cloth, powder, and whiskey, and rolled away groaning under buffalo robes, tallow, and tails. Kiowa lodges gleamed like pale shells on the north bank. Cheyenne men lounged near the corral, swapping gossip for cartridges. The fort kept no Sabbath. Trade was its only faith. Elias Boone Hardesty came in from the east gate at sunset, dust white on his boots, the map flat against his ribs. He had spent the winter tracing old trails between the Sangre ridges, finding more questions than ore. The friar's mark had led him to slag and silence, nothing more. But the ground there was too scarred to be chance, and he was certain some truth lay just beyond the reach of his spade. At the forge he found Charles Bent himself, sleeves rolled and hair shining with sweat. The governor-to-be still looked more merchant than magistrate, neat beard, eyes always measuring. "Hardesty," he said, without looking up from the glowing iron he was shaping. "You didn't fall into your miracle hole, I see." "Not yet," Elias said, "but I found where the ground's been fed before." Bent's hammer paused mid-swing. "Meaning?" "Slag heaps, charred timbers, smelter stone black as night. Somebody worked that ground hard a long time ago, or the mountain's been fooling men since Coronado." Bent dunked the iron in the quench trough. Steam hissed. "Taos merchants would pay for your tale. They like their silver mined by ghosts." Elias smiled thinly. "Maybe I'll sell it when I'm sure it's only a tale." They walked the yard as twilight gathered. Street. Vrain was at the counting desk, sorting ledgers with a care that made every number sound like prayer. Kit Carson, hardly 20, sat on a barrel near the gate, carving at a piece of hickory. Larpenteur, fresh from the upper Missouri, was telling anyone who'd listen that the robe trade would drown them all in fortune if the buffalo kept breeding like sinners. Elias drifted among them, invisible but listening. He heard the languages of an empire that had no flag, French, Spanish, Cheyenne, Pawnee, English, each reshaping the other. The rhythm of trade was a heartbeat, the slap of hides, the clink of coin, the scrape of flint, laughter that never quite trusted itself. Inside the main hall, the lamps smoked low. On one wall hung a map of the mountains, roughly sketched, its rivers as uncertain as rumors. Bent saw Elias studying it. "Your Friar's Ridges aren't on that chart," he said. "We draw country we can sell. No one buys mystery." "Maybe mystery's what keeps men moving," Elias answered. Street Vrain looked up from his book. "Moving's fine, dying's cheaper. Ask those who went north with Jed Smith." That name drew a hush. Jedediah Smith had gone quiet somewhere beyond the Green River, the best of them all, a man half prophet and half cartographer of the impossible. Hardesty had read the journal pages that drifted back the clean, spare hand that turned hunger and frostbite into scripture. He wondered if Smith, too, had chased a line drawn by faith. Later, outside by the fire, he sat with Carson and a few Arapaho hunters. They passed a jug that smelled of corn and alkali. One of the hunters, an old man with a scar running from ear to collarbone, leaned forward. "You look for silver in the Red Hills," he said in slow English. "Many white men do. The ground there remembers." "Remembers what?" Elias asked. "Men who dug too deep. They called to the fire under the mountain. The fire answered." The old man's smile was thin. "No beaver there now. No grass. Only stone that sings when you strike it." Carson spat into the fire. "Sounds like you've got your sermon, Elias." Elias let the laughter roll over him. He had heard too many half-truths to tell where the lies began. Yet something in the old man's tone lingered not fear, but respect, as if the mountain were an elder that punished curiosity with fairness. That night, lying on a buffalo hide near the half-built bastion, Elias listened to the fort breathe. Beyond the walls, wolves threaded the darkness, and the river whispered its old song of distance. Inside, men dreamed of prophets, women of home, horses of grass. He dreamed of a tunnel mouth carved in blood-red stone, and the friar's mark cut above it like a blessing turned warning. In the gray before dawn, Bent found him packing his gear. "You heading out again already?" "Before I start thinking like a merchant," Elias said. Bent nodded. "You'll be back when the snow comes. Every mountain man comes back, even if it's only in a story." He extended a small pouch. "Powder and ball, on the fort's account. And this," he handed over a compass, brass dulled by years. "When the map lies, let the needle talk." Elias took it, feeling its weight. "You don't believe in my mine." Bent's eyes narrowed against the dawn glare. "Belief's a luxury, same as whiskey. But I do believe in men who keep walking." By sunrise, Elias was riding west again, the fort shrinking behind him into the haze. He did not look back. Ahead lay the Sangre de Cristo, veiled in blue and promise. Somewhere among those peaks waited the friar's mark or proof that it had never been more than a fever dream. The trade world's laughter still echoed faintly in his ears, but under it ran another sound. The mountain wind, whispering like the breath of the dying friar, "The mountain keeps what it takes." And with that whisper guiding him, Elias Boone Hardesty pressed on toward the crimson wall of stone, carrying nothing but a compass, a myth, and the stubborn belief that somewhere out there, faith and earth might meet in silver. The Sangre de Cristo mountains rose ahead like a tide of stone, their ridges streaked with snow even in midsummer. For 3 days Elias Boone Hardesty rode into their shadow, the plains falling away behind him like a forgotten promise. The air thinned, dry and sharp enough to sting his lungs. Pinon and juniper gave way to dark spruce, and the earth turned red as raw iron. Each evening the peaks bled the last light of the sun, as if the name Blood of Christ had been earned in fire. He followed no marked trail, only the logic of the map and the lean of the land. The friar's drawing showed a canyon running like a scar through the range, its mouth marked by the double cross and the sun. But maps could lie, mountains did not. They spoke through erosion and ruin, and Elias had learned to listen. By the 5th day he came upon a small party of trappers camped near a cold creek, their lean-tos patched with robe skins, smoke from their fire curling blue into the trees. They looked half wild, their clothes a patchwork of buckskin, army wool, and Indian beadwork. One of them, A tall man with a French braid down his back hailed him with a grin. "Ho, stranger, you look like you've been chasing a rumor up a mountain." "Could be," Elias said, dismounting. "Could be it's chasing me." The man laughed. "Name's Dupré. We're hunting sign where there ain't any left. Beaver's gone to heaven, Robe's gone to Street Louis. Sit, warm yourself. Fire's honest." Elias accepted the offer. Around the fire sat 3 others, a Crow half-blood called Thomas, a boy from Taos who mended traps, and a silent Blackfoot with eyes like obsidian. Their camp smelled of smoke, jerky, and sweat. When the talk turned to roots and streams, Elias listened close. He mentioned the old Spanish smelters he'd seen near Pecos. Dupré spat into the coals. "You followin' the Friar's ghost trail, then? Every fool in Taos tried that once. They say the mountains ate them, swallowed the picks, left the prayers." "I've seen slag," Elias said. "Not rumor. Stone that's burned. Burned stone. Don't make silver," Thomas said softly. "Makes graves." That night, after the others slept, Elias sat watching the fire sink to coals. He took the friar's map from its oilskin and studied it under the trembling light. The cross, the sunburst, the jagged lines they matched too well to dismiss. He had seen shapes in the sangre's folds that mirrored the drawing. Whether that was faith or folly, he could no longer tell. At dawn he parted ways with the trappers. Dupré called after him, "If you find gold, don't tell the priests. If you find bones, don't tell the devil." The words followed him up the trail like a benediction turned curse. The climb grew harder. The trail narrowed to the width of his mule's hooves. Snowmelt streamed across the rock like threads of glass. Sometimes he dismounted to lead the animal, testing each step with his rifle butt. Twice he slipped, once badly enough to tear his sleeve and scrape his arm to blood. By midday he reached a high basin, ringed with cliffs. The air was still, and the silence had the weight of a cathedral. In the basin's center stood a mound of stone, half overgrown with moss, its sides blackened as if by old fire. When he struck it with his knife, the sound rang metallic. Beneath the moss he found shapes no nature had made, blocks squared by hand, edges straight as scripture. He knelt there a long time, running his fingers over the marks. Near the base, barely visible under lichen, was the friar's symbol, the double cross and the sunburst. The same hand that had drawn his map had carved this in stone. A storm rolled down from the peaks before he could set camp. The wind came first, carrying the metallic scent of rain and far-off lightning. Then the sky broke. He dragged his gear under the lee of a fallen pine and huddled beneath his blanket. The rain came slantwise, then sideways, then as if from the ground itself. When it passed, the world smelled clean and dangerous. That night he built a fire and melted snow in his tin cup. The flames painted the stone mound in flickering gold. He thought of the friar's dying eyes, the trembling hand, the words, "They dug for God, but found only themselves." Maybe this was what he meant, men carving faith into the mountain until it answered in ore and ruin. He dreamed of tunnels lit by torches, of men coughing in the dark, of a bell tolling far beneath the earth. When he woke, the fire was low and the stars had vanished behind cloud. From somewhere up the canyon came a sound, not wind, not water, but a dull rhythmic thud like a hammer striking stone. It echoed twice, then was gone. In the gray light of morning he climbed the ridge above the basin. From there he could see the country fall away in folds of red and green. A river shimmered in the valley far below, curving like the line on the friar's map. On the opposite slope he spotted what might have been a cut into the rock square, shadowed and out of place. His breath caught. He shaded his eyes and stared until the sun burned them. The entrance stood half collapsed, but it was there a tunnel mouth rimmed with black stone. He descended carefully, heart pounding, the friar's words ringing in his head. The mountain keeps what it takes. By midday he reached the mouth. The air that poured from it was cold and stale, carrying the smell of old fire and wet stone. Around the entrance lay chunks of broken ore, fused by heat, and the remains of timbers so brittle they turned to dust at his touch. Above the lintel he saw it again, the same symbol carved in relief, weathered but defiant. Elias Boone Hardesty stood at the threshold, one hand on the stone, one on his rifle. The world behind him was bright, the world within a darkness that seemed to breathe. He thought of Bent's laughter, of the friar's trembling faith, of the countless men who had traded their years for whispers of treasure. He stepped forward once, then stopped. Some instinct, not fear, not reason, told him the mine would wait. For now, the legend was alive, and he was part of it. He built camp just below the entrance, the firelight glinting on the carved cross above. As night settled over the Sangre de Cristo, Elias Boone Hardesty stared into the dark mouth of the mountain and felt the line between belief and truth growing thinner than the flame of his candle. The sun had barely cleared the ridges when Elias Boone Hardesty began to dig. His pick struck stone, then clay, then a seam of dark soil that smelled of iron and rain. Around him the walls of the high canyon glowed red as fire brick, their faces streaked with white quartz. Below, the land folded away into shadow. Above, the peaks burned with light. He worked slow and careful, like a man shaving the skin of the world. Each strike of the pick sent echoes rolling back from the cliffs, a metallic song that stirred something deep in his chest. Near noon, his blade hit something harder than earth, a splintered timber, blackened and fused by heat. When he brushed the dirt away, he saw a pattern in the rock, the faint outline of a shaft, its entrance collapsed, its floor buried in rubble. The friar had not lied. Men had dug here once. By evening his arms trembled, his palms blistered raw. He sat back on his heels, staring at the half-cleared tunnel mouth. From within, a faint breeze whispered, cool and stale, carrying the smell of old smoke. The timbers inside had turned to charcoal, but still they held, like ribs in a long-dead body. That night he wrote by firelight in his journal. The mark was true. There is a mine here, buried and bound. The friar's hand spoke plain. If this be folly, it is at least an honest one. He slept light and dreamed of silver veins running like rivers under the rock. In his dream, he followed one until it ended in a pool of mercury that mirrored his own face. When he bent closer, the reflection smiled back, but it was not his smile. At dawn, the sound of hoofbeats woke him. 3 riders climbed into the canyon, Dupré, the Frenchman, with the Crow half-blood Thomas and the Taos boy behind him. Their horses were gaunt and hollow-eyed. Dupré grinned when he saw Elias's camp. "We followed your trail easy enough," he said. "You left a scar through the hills." "I didn't mean to," Elias said. "Nothing means to, until the ground remembers." Dupré swung down and looked at the mine. "So this is it, the friar's belly. Looks more like a grave to me." "Graves and mines are kin," Elias answered. "Both made by men who believe in resurrection." Thomas walked to the shaft, knelt, and touched the scorched rock. "Smelter fire," he murmured. "See the black glass? That's quicksilver burn. Spaniards used it to draw silver from the ore. But it poisons the air. Men working here would have coughed their lungs red." Dupré chuckled low. "Then they died rich, or just died. No one dies. Rich in a hole," Elias said. Still, curiosity won. They cleared the entrance together, prying loose the last timbers. The shaft sloped downward into shadow. They lit pine knots for torches and stepped inside. The light trembled on the walls, revealing veins of gray metal glittering under soot. Farther in, they found the remains of a crucible cracked and dusted with silver ash. Elias's torch flared, throwing long shadows. Something caught his eye, a mark on the wall, cut deep. The same double cross, the same sunburst. He ran his fingers over it, feeling the grooves. "The friar was here," he whispered. Behind him, Dupré's voice turned soft. "Then where is he now?" Elias didn't answer. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of centuries. In the corner lay 2 skeletons, their bones blackened by soot, their skulls turned toward each other as if still speaking. Among them gleamed a dull piece of metal, a crucifix melted into the shape of a tear. Thomas crossed. Himself. They never left. Dupré exhaled through his teeth. "So there's your treasure, Boone Hardesty. Bones and ghosts." They left the shaft before nightfall, sealing it loosely with stones. Around the fire, they said little. The flames turned blue where drops of mercury hissed in the dirt. Elias sat apart, watching the sparks drift into the dark. He thought of Bent's words, "Truth pays worst of any trade good we handle." He had found truth, and it had the taste of metal and sorrow. When the wind rose, it carried with it a strange sound, not quite a voice, not quite the mountain's groan, but something between them. It came from the direction of the mine, deep and hollow. Dupré stirred uneasily. "The hill's breathing," he said. "No," Elias said, eyes on the dark slope. "It's remembering." Before dawn the canyon shuddered, once a low rumble, a sigh from the earth's gut. A section of the cliff gave way, sending stones crashing down the slope. When the dust settled, the mine was gone, buried again under tons of red rock. They stood in silence, the dawn light bleeding through the dust. Thomas whispered a prayer. Dupré spat into the earth and muttered, "So much for silver." Elias only stared at the slope. "The mountain keeps what it takes," he said quietly. They left the canyon that morning. Behind them, smoke from their dying fire rose into the thin blue air and vanished, just as surely as the friar's map would one day fade to dust. But in Elias's chest, the mountain's voice still echoed, steady, patient, eternal, promising that some truths, once unearthed, never go back to sleep. For 3 days the storm clawed at the Sangre de Cristo like a living thing. And for 3 days Elias Boone Hardesty could not shake the sound of that mountain sigh, the low groan that had buried the mine and sealed its secret again. The wind screamed down the canyon, shoving grit into his beard, and the clouds pressed so low they seemed to scrape the peaks raw. The others had ridden east after the collapse, half believing they had seen the mountain swallow itself. Elias lingered, unwilling to leave what he had found, unwilling to believe it was over. On the 4th morning the sky tore open, pure blue between rags of cloud. The land steamed where rain had soaked it. Elias climbed the slope alone. The rock slide had filled the mouth of the tunnel, but not completely. Water trickled from beneath, carrying with it the smell of cold iron. He began to dig again, cautious this time, carving a narrow passage no wider than his shoulders. By dusk he had cleared a crawl space. He lit a torch and slid inside. The air was damp and sour, thick with the memory of mercury. As he moved deeper, the sound of his own breathing became strange. Each exhale bounced back a half-beat late, as if the mountain answered him. The place was alive with echo, whispering his movements in a voice that wasn't quite his own. He found the chamber only a dozen yards in, a hollow cut by hand and fire, its walls fused smooth where smelter heat had once run wild. Scattered on the floor were the remains of tools picks eaten by rust, a broken crucible, and the faint glimmer of something metallic half buried in silt. He knelt and brushed it clean. Silver, or what was left of it. Not enough to weigh a man's purse, but enough to prove the story had been true. Elias sat back, torch guttering. The silence pressed close, but underneath it he heard something else, a rhythmic drip like a slow clock. He followed the sound to the far wall, where a fissure split the stone. Cool air pulsed through it, carrying faint light from somewhere below. The friar's map had shown only a single shaft, yet here was another vein of darkness calling to be entered. He hesitated. The last cave had cost 2 men their bones, another might claim his. But the promise of discovery worked in him like fever. He widened the crack with his pick, then squeezed through. On the other side lay a narrow chute descending into a deeper cavern. He slid down the slope, boots grinding on gravel. The air grew colder. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a vault of stone, lit by his flickering torch, a chamber taller than a church nave, the ceiling lost in shadow. Along the walls ran black stains of soot, and higher still, faint carvings. Crosses, suns, Latin prayers scorched half away. He raised the torch higher and saw what lay in the center. A pile of rubble shaped like a cairn, and in it, caught between 2 stones, the edge of a wooden beam carved with letters burned by time. He traced them with one finger, Soli Deo Gloria. For God alone the glory. That was when the echo began. It came without wind, a murmur rising from the stone itself, rolling around the chamber until it circled him like a chant. The air vibrated, and small stones rattled from the walls. Elias backed toward the crack, heart hammering. The torch sputtered. He cupped it in his hand, whispering to himself that sound was only sound, that air and shape could trick the ear. Still, when the whisper formed his name, a drawn-out Boone, stretched thin and hollow, he dropped the torch. The flame hit the ground and went out. Darkness closed in, heavy as soil. For one long minute he heard only his heartbeat and the slow settling of dust. Then silence, deep and absolute. He waited until his eyes adjusted to the faint gray from the fissure above. Inch by inch he felt his way back up the chute, tearing his palms bloody on the rock. When he burst out into the open air, dawn was breaking over the peaks, the world washed in pale gold. He fell to his knees and laughed, not from humor, but from relief at hearing a sound that belonged to the living. When he looked back, the cave mouth was weeping smoke, thin as breath in winter. He did not go back. He filled the entrance with stones and piled them high, until the cross carved above it disappeared beneath rubble. By the time he rode down the mountain, snow had begun to fall again, light, dry flakes swirling in the wind like ashes. The friar's map lay folded in his breast pocket, but its meaning had changed. The lines no longer pointed toward treasure. They marked instead the graves of men who had believed too fiercely. He would return to Bent's Fort by spring, thin and gray, his beard full of dust and his hands trembling when he spoke. He would tell no one what he had heard inside the Echo mine. But at night, when the wind came down the river, he would sometimes turn his head as if listening, and the men who saw it would whisper that Elias Boone Hardesty had left part of himself in the mountain, and that when the peaks were quiet you could still hear him breathing under the stone. 3 years had passed since Elias Boone Hardesty sealed the mouth of the Echo mine, and still the Sangre de Cristo haunted his sleep. When spring winds returned to the Arkansas Valley, he found himself drawn once more toward Bent's Fort, the only place where memory and the living world seemed to meet. The fort had changed. What had once been scaffolding and ambition now stood as a fortress of trade, its walls sun-hardened and tall enough to throw shadows like towers. Flags fluttered above the parapets, the American, the Mexican, and the Cheyenne, all treated with equal pragmatism. Mule bells chimed in the yard, wagon tongues creaked. The air smelled of leather, wood smoke, and tallow. Hardesty rode in at dusk, lean as a lath and silent as a ghost. His coat was patched, his rifle wrapped in rawhide, and the lines around his eyes had deepened into canyons. Those who knew him glanced up and nodded, as one nods to a man returned from the dead. Inside the courtyard, Charles Bent looked up from a ledger. "By God, Elias," he said, "the mountains let you go after all." "Maybe," Elias said, "or maybe they only loaned me out." Bent poured him a tin cup of Taos whiskey, the rough kind that bit twice going down. "Tell me you found your fortune." Elias took a long swallow, set the cup down, and smiled faintly. "Found proof, not fortune." Street Vrain came in, carrying a stack of trade tallies. "Proof feeds no mules, my friend." "Maybe not," Elias said. "But it quiets a man's ghosts, if only for a while." He spread the friar's map on the table. The paper had faded to the color of old bone, its ink cracked like river mud. Yet something new had appeared since he'd last unfolded it. Faint lines, ones he had not drawn now, traced the course of rivers and ridges with uncanny precision. He ran his finger along the curve of one and realized it matched the latest army survey Bent kept pinned to the wall. "The map's drawing itself," Bent muttered, leaning closer. "Or maybe time's catching up to it," Elias said. "Maybe the friar saw farther than we can measure." For a moment, no one spoke. Outside, the sound of a hammer on anvil marked the hours. Finally, Bent said, "You could sell that to Washington. They'd pay in coin just to prove a holy man knew the Rockies better than their engineers." Elias shook his head. "It's not for sale. It's for keeping." He left the fort the next day, not for the mountains, but for the open plains east, toward the rolling sea of grass that seemed to promise anonymity. He rode slow, following the old Santa Fe trail where the ruts were worn deep as scripture. Along the way, he met caravans heading west, merchants, soldiers, hopeful settlers, all chasing the same mirage under different names: gold, land, salvation. At night he camped alone, staring into the fire. The map lay across his knees, its lines shifting subtly in the glow, as if alive. He no longer saw roots or passes in them, only the story of men who had traded their peace for pursuit. He thought of the friar, of the burned crucible, of Dupré and Thomas, and the others who had vanished into rumor. Every mark on the paper felt like an epitaph. In late summer he returned to Pecos Pueblo. The ruins were quieter than he remembered. A swallow's nest clung to the cracked altar. The old bell tower had collapsed. He knelt in the same spot where the friar had died and buried the map there, sealing it under a stone. "Let it rest where it began," he murmured. "If the mountain wants it, it'll find its way back." He stayed a week among the ruins, sleeping under the open arch of the old church. On the last night, lightning danced over the Sangre de Cristo, and the mountains burned silver against the dark. For an instant, he thought he saw the sign of the friar's sunburst glowing on the peaks. A reminder or a farewell, he couldn't tell. When dawn came, he saddled his horse and rode north toward the Platte country. Those who later met him said he spoke little, traded fair, and looked at every horizon as if listening for something that was no longer there. Years after, a surveyor passing near Pecos found a fragment of parchment lodged in the earth, a corner of a map, brown and brittle, marked with a cross and a faint outline of mountains. The ink had blurred until it looked like veins on skin. He tucked it in his journal, unaware of its legend. And somewhere, high in the Sangre de Cristo, a breath of wind slipped through a crack in the stone where a mine once stood. It echoed once low, human, and almost tender, before vanishing into the silence that waits for all who chase the line between faith and fortune.